Looking at Joshua chapter 24, I made mention this morning, kind of our last study from the book of Joshua in our series of going through the Bible. And what we're going to look at tonight, of course, is based in part on what Joshua said there in the first part of the chapter, in chapter 24. But it's also based upon what we talked about this morning, and when we looked at a lesson that was entitled, Choose Who You Will Serve. Just kind of refresher some of the things that we pointed out this morning, but I think are relative tonight for what we're going to be talking about. Joshua knew that the people were caught up in indecision. And when you're kind of in a state of limbo, when you're kind of a state where you're trying to decide between one thing or another, what do you generally do? Well, what I would do is I would go back over the facts, wouldn't you? I would look at some of the fundamental information before I made a decision. And that's really what Joshua is doing here in Joshua chapter 24 when he's urging the children of Israel to make a choice, to make a decision. Of course, the decision that he was laying before them was, who were they going to serve? He said, well, you can dust off the old Mesopotamian gods, the gods that Abraham and his father served before I came along. You can go back and to the gods of the Egyptians like they did at Mount Sinai whenever they worshiped the golden calf. He said you can worship the gods of the Canaanites or the Amorites, kind of the gods come lately, these people in whose land you're dwelling here. But Jehovah was also an option for worshiping too. And that's what Joshua is doing. He's urging the children of Israel to make the right choice and not to lose out on that option of worshiping Jehovah God. So what he does here in the first part of chapter 24, he gives them a little bit of a history lesson. We might just say, well, just the facts of some of the things that they already know before they make a decision. Joshua, of course, at this time, he's an old man. I kind of got in trouble for talking about old people this morning, but I didn't point at Dennis or even mention him. I don't know why he got so offended, but Joshua was an old man at this time. While he may have been old, he still knew his history. And what we have here is him standing before all of Israel and going back for a historical record. It's actually God who's doing the speaking here, but Joshua is his mouthpiece. So what he does in this chapter is he starts mentioning some very famous names in Jewish history, names that would, of course, ring bells within the minds of people. And then he uses a lot of verbs to describe God as a God of action. The picture that Joshua paints of God in the history of mankind, and even specifically in the history of the Jewish nation, is that he is a God of interaction with his people. And what we want to talk about tonight is really, I think what Joshua is using here, and I kind of kicked around two different titles for the lesson, but it's probably better entitled Motivation to Serve the Lord, because that's what Joshua does for the children of Israel through this history lesson. So 4 things that I want for us to look at tonight that they could use as motivation to make the right choice and to choose to serve the Lord. The first thing that Joshua talks to them about in this chapter, in verses 2 through 4, is that God had chosen them. Why should we serve the Lord? Because God had chosen them to be a special people and a special nation. In verse 2, Joshua says to all the people, "Thus said the Lord God of Israel, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from the other side of the flood and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his seed and gave him Isaac. And I gave unto Isaac Jacob and Esau, and I gave unto Esau Mount Seir to possess it, but Jacob and his children went down into Egypt." I want you to stop and think about the special idea of God choosing people and even choosing Israel as a nation to do special things for him. When you think about Abraham, who would Abraham have been without God choosing him? I doubt that we would even know the name of Abraham today had Jehovah God not chosen him and called him out of his homeland. But it was the fact that God chose him that led to Abraham being somebody and doing special things. When you look at the life of Abraham, who would he have been? What would he have done? Well, probably nothing significant in history. Probably nothing that would have made us remember his name today. but the fact that God chose him made him special. And the fact that God gave him things to do etched his name in history. And so it made him a chosen person. It made him a very special being. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, we read there about the Lord not only choosing individuals, but also choosing a nation. And that nation we know, of course, was Israel, or the Jews. In verse 9 of that chapter, Moses would say, "For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land, and in the waste-howling wilderness. He led him about, he instructed him, he kept him as the apple of his eye." Think about the nation of Israel. What would the nation of Israel be without God choosing them? Well, they wouldn't even be a nation, right? They wouldn't even be in existence today. The fact that God chose them is what made them special. They were nobody before. They weren't even an established people or nation. But when God chose them, he made of Abraham a great nation, and from that he established their lineage, and he gave them a place to dwell and a kingdom to rule over. You know, the fact that, why did God choose these people? Well, what I want to emphasize to you is it wasn't because they were somebody in the first place. It wasn't because they were special from the beginning. They were nobody whenever God chose them. But it was God's choosing and his assignment to them that made them somebody special. And so here, remember, Israel was a special people at this time. They were living in a very blessed place. What made them, or who made them special? Who brought them to this place? Why were they living in such a wonderful environment? The answer is God. And so Joshua is encouraging them to choose to serve God, because he's the one who's chosen you. He's the one who has made you special. There's a great application for us. Of course, that's what we want from any lesson that we look at in the Bible. We want to learn, how can this benefit me? What can I learn from it? And we're talking about the choice to serve God. Why should we choose to serve the Lord today? Well, the answer is because God has chosen us. In fact, the Bible tells us in Ephesians chapter 1, beginning in verse 4, it says, "According as he hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us to the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will." Paul was writing about the fact that Christians were chosen before the world was even created. We were chosen to follow God. We were chosen to be his children. We were chosen to inherit his blessings. And so the fact that God has chosen us makes us somebody. It gives us an identity in this world, and it makes us special. And that's reason enough to serve him. After Joshua talks about Abraham, Joshua talks about Abraham's offspring. Of course, we know that Abraham had two sons. Ishmael was his firstborn son, but God didn't choose Ishmael, did he? God chose Isaac. And through Isaac, Isaac had two sons. He had Esau and he had Jacob. Esau was the firstborn. God chose Esau to be the father of the Edomites. God chose Esau to live in the area of Mount Seir. But he chose Jacob to be the father of the Jews and the father of the Israelites, and eventually to go down into Egypt. The point that I'm making is God chose them. They didn't choose God. And because God chose them, he gave them an opportunity to be associated with his great name. He gave them an opportunity for him to be their God and to inherit his blessings. And so Joshua says, choose to serve the Lord, because the Lord has chosen you and made you special. The second idea that comes from this chapter is, choose to serve the Lord because Jehovah is the one who has delivered you. What Joshua is talking about in verses 5 through 7 of this chapter is the fact that God alone, Jehovah God, was the one who delivered them out of Egyptian bondage. In verse 5, he said, "I sent Moses also and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt according to that which I did among them. And afterward I brought you out. And I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came unto the sea, and the Egyptians pursued after your fathers with chariots and horsemen unto the Red Sea. And when they cried unto the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. And he brought the sea upon them and covered them. And your eyes have seen what I have done in Egypt, and ye dwelt in the wilderness a long season." Now remember these names, these famous Jewish names that
Joshua is bringing out in this history lesson. He talks about Abraham, and he talks about Isaac, and he talks about Jacob. And now he begins talking about Moses and Aaron. But, you know, one of the names that's not dropped in this great history lesson is the name of Joseph, isn't it? I want you to think about for a moment just how the children of Israel, how God had this great plan to deliver them before they ever were slaves, before they ever got into Egyptian bondage. In fact, the psalmist writes about it in Psalm chapter 105. I'm not going to read all those verses, but he simply says this in verse 17. He said, speaking of God, he sent a man before them, even Joseph. God had Joseph hand-picked, hand-chosen to go before the children of Israel even step foot into Egypt. He sent Joseph before them to preserve them during the days of the famine so that they could have a place where they could go and eat food, and not only eat food in that environment, but thrive and multiply and grow within that great environment. God had this great plan in mind for His nation before they even stepped foot in Israel. In fact, when you think about them dwelling within the land of Israel, of course, you know, they multiply and they grow at such a rate that eventually they begin their number grows so high that the Egyptians are starting to get concerned. They said, hey, we got all these slaves out here. What are we going to do if they decide they don't want to be our slaves anymore? What are we going to do if they decide that they want to take over our empire? And so we've got to do something. We've got to persecute them. And so that's what Pharaoh did. And it was after God hears the cry of that persecution that He sends Moses to be their deliverer. But think about this question. Why did Moses deliver the children of Israel? Why did he go down there? And why did he talk to Pharaoh? And why did he risk his life? It was because God planned and purposed and told him to do it, right? Jehovah was the force behind all of these things. In fact, if you go back to the book of Exodus and you read Exodus chapter 3, you'll probably remember that Moses, at least at this point in his life, he didn't even have delivering Israel on his mind. That was probably the farthest thing from his mind that he wanted to do, kind of seen in his reaction. But we read in Exodus chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, what's Moses doing? Well, Moses is keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. And he's leading that flock on the backside of the desert. He comes to the mountain of God, to the mount of Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked back, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Remember what Moses was doing when God told him to go deliver Israel? He was just walking around in the desert, wasn't he? He was really just working and minding his own business. He didn't come up with this idea, hey, I think I might need to go down into Egypt to deliver Israel. Let me run this by God first and see that if it's okay with Him. All of this was because of God. It was God that spoke to Moses from the burning bush. In verses 7 through 10, we read about how God says, I've seen the affliction of my people. I've heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. He said, I know their sorrows. And so I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up unto the land, the good large land that flows with milk and honey. And in verse 10 he says, Come now therefore, I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt because God told him to. And so God judges the Egyptians through the 10 plagues. Pharaoh, of course, eventually threw them out just like God had planned. And then later on, Pharaoh changes his mind and decides that he needs to go bring Israel back. And what does God do? Well, God just parts the Red Sea and leads His people through it and drowns all the Egyptians in the waters that are left behind. You know, the Jews had been slaves in Egypt. This was their history. How did they get out of Egypt? Who delivered them? The answer is the Lord. And so why should I choose to serve the Lord? Because He's the one who delivered you. It wasn't the gods of Mesopotamia that delivered them. It wasn't the gods of the Egyptians that had delivered them. It wasn't the God of the Amorites or the Canaanites in whose land they were dwelling. It was only Jehovah God. There's a passage in the New Testament, in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. It says this, The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. God knows how to deliver those who are His. Did He know how to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Egyptians? Absolutely. He had a plan before they ever stepped foot in that country. And so think about this question. Again, we're applying it to us today. Why should we serve Jehovah? Who delivered you? Who delivered you from sin and from death and destruction? It wasn't the gods of Mesopotamia, was it? Was it the gods of the Egyptians or the Amorites or the Canaanites? It was Jehovah God himself. And so Joshua encourages them to serve the Lord because he is the one who had delivered them. The third thing that I want to point out is, in this history lesson, he reminds them that God was the one who guided them. In verse 8, he said, I brought you into the land of the Amorites, which dwelt on the other side of Jordan. And they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand that you might possess their land, and I destroyed them from before you. Then Balak the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and warred against Israel, and sent and called Balaam the son of Beor to curse you. But I would not hearken unto Balaam, therefore he blessed you still, so I delivered you out of his hand. You think about what God did for Israel from the time that he brought them out of the land of Egypt. You know, he didn't just bring them out of Egypt and without a destination in mind. In other words, when God brings them out of Egypt, he doesn't say, okay, I'm done. You know, I did what I intended to do. God brought them out to go into a certain place. And that particular place was the Promised Land. For 40 years, they wandered in the wilderness. Who took care of it? It was God, wasn't it? He guided them in the day with the cloudy pillar. He guided them at night with the fiery pillar. He gave them manna from heaven. He miraculously preserved their shoes and their clothes so they didn't have to worry about those things in the wilderness. God was the one who had guided them. Again, it wasn't the gods of Mesopotamia. It wasn't the gods of Egypt. It wasn't the gods of the Amorites and the Canaanites. It was Jehovah God and he alone. You know, even though enemies fought against them, when they went into the Promised Land and when they came out of the land of Egypt, it was God who took care of them, wasn't it? It was God who parted the Red Sea. It was God who sent hornets before them to help drive out their enemies. If people were trying to defeat God's people, but the Lord fought for them and defeated everybody who opposed them. God was the one who had guided them through this great journey. And so Joshua encourages them, serve the Lord, because he's the one who's guided you. You know, you think of us as Christians today, who is it that's guiding us through this great journey that we're on? Who is it that's brought us out of sin like he brought the children of Israel out of Israel? Who is it that is bringing us into a promised land? Who is it that's laid out the pathway before us and defeats our enemies that would fight against us? The Lord is our guide today too, just like he guided his people in times past. Remember to serve the Lord because God is the one who guides us. The fourth thing that I'll mention here in this history lesson is Joshua says, serve the Lord because he is the one who's given you all these good things. In verse 11, he said, you went over Jordan and came unto Jericho, and the men of Jericho fought against you, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. And I delivered them into your hand. And I sent the hornet before you, which drave them out from before you, even the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with thy sword, nor with thy bow. And I have given you a land for which ye did not labor, and cities which ye built not, and ye dwell in them, and the vineyards and the olive yards which ye did not plant, but now you do eat. Once again, the emphasis is on the goodness of God here, all that God has done for Israel. Joshua talks about how God took them across the Jordan River to their inheritance. He talks about how God defeated their enemies for them. And then, of course, we all know the story of how they had all this land now. They had these tremendous cities and houses to live in. They had great, abundant olive yards and vineyards. Where did they get all these things? Did they plant them? Did they work for them? No, God simply handed them over all these things. They didn't have to build their own houses. They didn't have to plant their own vineyards or olive yards. They didn't have to build their own cities. God gave all these good things into their hands. The Bible reminds us, of course, of this very idea in James chapter 1 and verse 17. James wrote there, he said, every good gift and perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. The Lord has given us every good thing that we have here in this life. Do you know how many good things we would enjoy in this life if God were not here? The answer is 0. there would be nothing good for us to enjoy. But every good thing that we enjoy in this life, where does it come from? It comes from above, doesn't it? God is the giver of good gifts. And so the good things that we get to enjoy in this life are all because of God. But the great things are yet to come. The greatest things that we will ever enjoy in our living here, our living in existence, is nothing short of the great eternal blessings that God has prepared for those who are faithful with Him. Without God, I have nothing good. Where would Israel have been without Jehovah God? They wouldn't have those good cities and those good houses and good vineyards and olive yards. All of those were because of God Himself. But with God, we not only have access to good things here upon this earth, we have access to all the great things that lay beyond this world. All spiritual blessings, Paul would say, are given to us through Jesus Christ. Ephesians 1 and verse 3. You know, this is a history lesson that Joshua presents to the people of his day and age, and it's a history lesson that's really all about God. If you never read chapter 24, I'd encourage you to do that and look at all the times where God says, I did this or I did that. If you go through that chapter, you'll find God saying, I took and I led and I multiplied and I gave and I sent and I plagued and I brought and I took and I covered and I destroyed it and I delivered. And the message that Joshua is emphasizing is God did all these things. Joshua is encouraging the people of his day, don't be so indecisive about who you're going to serve. While you may have all these options of all these gods to serve, really there's only one choice that makes any good sense, and that is Jehovah God. As you go to the end of this chapter, you'll find that 3 times the people affirm they desired to serve only the Lord. And Joshua takes them at His word. In fact, so they wouldn't forget this promise that they made of serving the Lord and wanting to serve the Lord, Joshua wrote it in a book. And he preserved that book for the children of Israel. And he sets up a monument to remind them of their agreement that they've made with God. You know, I think about this lesson. It's just one, I think, as Christians that we need to be reminded of from time to time. Because obviously, we're like the children of Israel. Right? We've said we want to serve the Lord. We make that decision. We make that choice. 3 times they positively affirm, yes, we want to serve God. But there are times when we need to be reminded of the covenant that we've made with God. Why should we keep on serving the Lord? Because God has chosen us. Who would we be without God? We would be nobody. But with God, we have a place, we have a purpose, we have an eternal destiny. Why should we serve the Lord? Because He's delivered us. He delivered us out of sin and from death and from destruction. Why should we serve the Lord? Because the Lord guides us. He's given us the roadmap that will give us to heaven. He's planned out our steps before we've even taken any of them. And why should we serve the Lord? Because God is the one who gives us all good things, not only in this life, but also the ones that are eternally prepared for us in the next. Maybe there's one that's present